Midnight tastes like diesel exhaust and decisions you can't take back. Platform 9 stretched into darkness like a sentence that had lost its period. The air carried the weight of departures, coffee gone cold in paper cups, newspapers folded around stories no one would finish reading, the metallic tang of rails that had guided more escapes than homecomings. Overhead, a single bulb flickered with the persistence of hope and the uncertainty of old wiring. Maya stood at the edge of the light, 17 years old and wearing responsibility like a coat 3 sizes too big. Her denim jacket had holes at the elbows from catching herself when she fell, or when someone pushed. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had given up trying to be neat hours ago. In her hand, a crumpled letter. In her chest, a heartbeat that sounded like footsteps getting closer. The boy beside her was small enough to hide behind luggage carts, young enough to believe that stuffed elephants could absorb fear through their fabric ears. Sam was 10, but his eyes held the careful distance of someone who had learned to measure adults by the volume of their voices and the steadiness of their hands. He pressed the elephant, gray felt worn soft by years of comfort, against his ribs like armor made of childhood. "Maya," he whispered, not because the platform was quiet, but because speaking louder might make the night hear them. "Are you sure?" She wasn't. She had been sure about exactly 3 things in her life: that she loved her brother more than breathing, that their father's promises came with expiration dates, and that Sam's bruises were getting harder to hide under sleeves and stories. Everything else was weather. Unpredictable, occasionally gentle, mostly not. "I'm sure," she lied, and meant it completely. The train idled like a sleeping dragon that might wake up friendly or hungry. Steam rose from its undercarriage in lazy spirals that caught the platform light and turned it into something that looked almost like hope. The locomotive was older than promises, painted deep blue with gold numbers that had faded to the color of old wedding rings. Along its side, script lettering spelled out Atlantic and Eastern in the kind of font that remembered when trains were the only way to disappear. From the conductor's car, a man stepped into the space between staying and going. Thomas Murphy had been working these rails for 37 years, minus the 2 he'd spent in a bottle trying to forget why he'd started. His uniform was pressed but weathered, like a flag that had seen too many storms to surrender to any of them. His hands, scarred from years of coupling cars and uncoupling himself from things that hurt, rested easy at his sides. But his eyes swept the platform with the alertness of someone who had learned that midnight passengers usually carried more than luggage. He saw them immediately: the girl with the military posture and civilian fear, the boy whose smallness made the platform looked like an ocean. Thomas had children once, had a wife once, had a house with a garden where he'd planted things he'd never seen bloom because the rails had called him away every spring. He knew the shape of loss from every angle, and he recognized it in the way Maya held her brother's hand, not leading but anchoring. The train's bell rang once, a brass note that said "last call" in the language of departures. Maya stepped forward, then stopped. The letter in her fist was a court summons that had arrived that morning, addressed to their father. Child welfare investigation, it said at the top, in letters that didn't care about the careful lies she'd been telling teachers, about the makeup she'd learned to apply to hide the finger-shaped bruises on Sam's arms, about the nights they'd slept in her closet because the living room was too close to where their father practiced his rage. "All aboard," Thomas called, not loudly. His voice carried the authority of someone who had learned that power was quieter when it was real. "Last train to anywhere." Sam looked up at Maya with eyes that held questions he was too young to ask and old enough to know the answers to. "Anywhere sounds good," he said, and it was both joke and prayer. Maya approached the train car like approaching a door that might lead to freedom or a different kind of prison. "2 tickets," she said to Thomas, pulling crumpled bills from her pocket. She had $47, 3 months of babysitting. The neighbor's twins, minus the cost of groceries because their father forgot that children needed to eat when he was busy nursing grudges. Thomas looked at the money, counted it with his eyes, and did the arithmetic that mattered. 2 children plus $47 plus midnight plus the way the girl's hand shook, divided by the boy's bruised wrist, equals a story he'd been part of before, from the other direction. "Where to?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would be away. "How far does this take us?" Maya asked back, which was not an answer, and was the most honest response possible. Thomas studied them, the careful way the girl positioned herself between her brother and any potential threat, the way the boy's eyes tracked every shadow on the platform, the letter she was trying to hide that had the state seal embossed on it like a brand. He had seen this story before. He had lived versions of it. Some ended with reunions, some with restraining orders, some with children who grew up and became conductors because trains were the only reliable thing they'd ever known. End of the line is Millfield, he said. Small town, quiet, good people who mind their own business until it becomes their business. He paused, weighing the next words like measuring ingredients for something that either nourished or poisoned. Fares $45 each. Maya's face did something that wasn't quite breaking but was definitely bending. Sam's grip on the stuffed elephant tightened until his knuckles went white as bone. Thomas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his conductor's punch, the tool that had marked thousands of tickets over 3 decades. Course, he said, voice carrying a different kind of weight now. I might have miscounted the passenger manifest tonight. Seems like I've got 2 comp tickets here that need using before they expire. He held out his hand for their money. $47 should cover snacks from the dining car. Growing children need snacks. Maya stared at him with the suspicious gratitude of someone who had learned that kindness often came with strings attached. Why? She asked. Because she was 17 and had earned the right to mistrust generosity. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, then at Sam, then back at the platform where the single bulb continued its nervous dance between light and darkness. Because, he said finally, sometimes the right thing and the legal thing are cousins who don't get along. And because 37 years ago I was a different kind of fool who chose the rails over staying home, and maybe this is how I pay the interest on that debt. The train whistle blew. 2 long notes that sounded like a question being asked of the night sky. All aboard, Thomas said again. And this time it sounded like an invitation to a different life. Maya climbed the metal steps first, testing each one for stability, for trap, for the kind of kindness that didn't cost more than you could pay. Sam followed, clutching both the elephant and the railing, because trust was something you did with your whole body or not at all. The door closed behind them with the solid thunk of a decision that couldn't be undone. The ticket we couldn't buy. The train car smelled like leather seats that had absorbed decades of conversations and coffee, that had learned to be patient with travelers who needed time to figure out their destinations. Red velvet curtains framed windows that showed the platform, sliding away like a stage set being struck after the final performance. Maya and Sam found seats facing forward, always forward, never back, and settled into the rhythm of wheels on rails that sounded like a heartbeat someone had set to the tempo of escape. Thomas moved through the car with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to see without staring. 3 other passengers, a woman in a nurse's uniform heading home from a double shift, her head already tilted against the window in the universal position of earned sleep, an old man with a chess set open on the table before him, playing against himself with the concentration of someone who had learned that the best opponent was the one who knew all your weaknesses, and a couple in their 30s sharing earbuds and looking at each other like they were still surprised to be in love after all this time. None of them looked up when the children passed. Train travel was a democratic anonymity. Everyone was running from something, or toward something, and the wisdom was to let people carry their stories without commentary. Maya arranged Sam by the window so he could watch the city lights turn into suburbs, turn into farmland, turn into the kind of darkness that meant they were really, truly leaving. She kept the letter folded in her palm like a talisman of everything they were escaping. The court date was in 3 days. The investigator wanted to interview Sam alone, wanted to ask him questions about why he flinched when adults raised their voices, why his teacher had noted that he drew pictures of houses with no doors, why the school nurse had filed a report about finger-shaped bruises that Maya had explained away as roughhousing with neighborhood kids. The truth was a luxury they couldn't afford. The truth was that their father, Marcus Rivera, was a man who had been hollowed out by his own childhood and filled with something that looked like love, but burned like kerosene. The truth was that he hit when he drank and drank when he remembered that his wife had left them for a life that didn't include the sound of his fists against walls. The truth was that Maya had been lying to protect him for 3 years until she realized that protecting him meant sacrificing Sam. "I'm hungry," Sam said quietly, more out of habit than actual appetite. Hunger was something that came and went like weather, and he had learned to mention it the way you might mention a cloud, acknowledging it without expecting anyone to do anything about it. Maya pulled out the remainder of her money. $47 had become $37 when she'd bought bus fare to get them to the station. She calculated, food for tonight, maybe breakfast, maybe enough to keep them alive until she figured out what came next. "What do you want?" she asked, because giving Sam choices was one of the few ways she could still parent him. "Something that tastes like celebration," he said, which was such a 10-year-old thing to say that Maya felt her chest crack open with love and worry in equal measure. Thomas appeared beside their seat with the silent approach of someone who had learned to read the emotional weather of a train car. "Dining cars closed," he said, "but the engineer's wife packed extra sandwiches tonight. Ham and Swiss if you're not vegetarians. Cookies if you are vegetarians but still believe in sugar." Maya started to reach for her money again, but Thomas held up a hand. "Company policy," he said. "First-time passengers get the welcome meal. Very important policy. Very strictly enforced." He winked at Sam, who giggled despite himself, a sound like silver coins dropping into still water. They followed Thomas through the swaying connection between cars, Sam's hand finding the rhythm of the train's movement like a dancer learning a new step. The dining car was officially closed, but Thomas had turned on the small overhead lights that made the empty tables look like islands of possibility. He disappeared behind the service counter and emerged with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper that crackled like promises, chocolate chip cookies in a paper sleeve, and 2 bottles of milk that were somehow still cold. "Engineer's wife is Maria," Thomas said, settling across from them with his own cup of coffee that steamed like a small prayer. "She's got 5 grandchildren and the persistent belief that no one under the age of 30 eats properly. You're doing her a public service by accepting these." Maya bit into the sandwich and tasted something she had almost forgotten. Food prepared by someone who cared whether it nourished. The bread was soft, the ham thick enough to matter, the cheese sharp enough to wake up taste buds that had grown accustomed to whatever was on sale and wouldn't spoil if the electricity got turned off again. Sam ate with the focused attention of someone who had learned not to take meals for granted. Between bites, he showed Thomas the stuffed elephant. "His name is Buster," he said. "He's been to 17 states and 2 different schools, and one time he went to the emergency room when I had to get stitches." 17 states? Thomas repeated with appropriate awe. "That's more than most elephants see in a lifetime." "What's his favorite so far?" Sam considered this with the seriousness of a diplomat discussing treaties. "Montana," he decided, "because it was big enough to hide in if you needed to, but not so big you'd get lost forever." Maya caught Thomas looking at her over Sam's head, and in that look was a recognition that made her throat tight. He knew, not the details but the shape of it. The way children talked about hiding and getting lost in emergency rooms like they were travel destinations instead of symptoms of a childhood that had gone wrong somewhere along the way. "Maya," Thomas said, voice casual in the way that meant the next words would be anything but, "You mind if I ask where you're planning to stay in Millfield? Just so I can point you toward the right end of town." She hadn't thought that far ahead. Her planning had extended to get Sam away, get on a train, get somewhere else. After that was a blank page she'd been hoping would write itself. "We'll figure something out," she said, which was the answer people gave when they didn't have an answer. Thomas nodded as if figuring something out was a reasonable plan that had worked for lots of people throughout history. "Town's got a good shelter," he said. "Run by a woman named Claire who used to be married to a railroad man. She understands about sudden arrivals." He paused, stirred his coffee, though it didn't need stirring. "Course, there's also the option of talking to someone about making the sudden arrival a little less sudden, if you know what I mean." Maya knew what he meant. She also knew that talking to someone meant questions, and questions meant forms, and forms meant investigations, and investigations meant Sam getting placed with strangers, while she got placed in a system that would try to fix her instead of the man who had broken them both. "We just need a couple days," she said, "to figure things out." "Couple days is what everyone needs," Thomas agreed. "Funny how couple days has a way of turning into whatever it needs to turn into, given the right circumstances. Miles between here and safe." The train moved through the night like a prayer being spoken in a language only the rails understood. Maya dozed despite herself, her head against the window. watching telephone poles flick past like a metronome keeping time for someone else's song. Sam had fallen asleep with Buster clutched against his chest, his breathing soft and even in the way of children who had learned to sleep light, but finally felt safe enough to sleep deep. Thomas made his rounds through the cars with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that checking on people was both job and calling. He punched tickets that didn't need punching, adjusted, reading lights for passengers who weren't reading, and performed the small rituals that kept the night moving forward toward dawn. When he returned to the dining car, Maya was awake, staring out at the darkness that held farmhouses like scattered stars. "Can't sleep on trains," she said, though this wasn't true. She'd been afraid to sleep, afraid that closing her eyes might make this all disappear, might make her wake up back in the apartment with the thin walls and the heavy footsteps and the sound of Sam crying through the heating vent. "Train sleep is different," Thomas acknowledged, settling back into his seat. "Takes getting used to. The motion, the sound, the feeling of being carried instead of carrying." He paused. "Some people never get used to it. Some people can't sleep any other way once they've learned." "Which kind are you?" Maya asked, because questions were safer than statements, and personal curiosity was safer than talking about herself. "The second kind," Thomas said, and there was a story in his voice that he didn't tell. "Been riding rails so long that regular beds feel too still, like the world forgot to move under me." They sat in comfortable quiet, listening to the train sing its steel song. Outside, a town flashed past, streetlights in neat rows, a gas station glowing like a beacon, houses with porch lights left on for people who were expected home. "Thomas?" Maya said, because she had decided to trust him with his real name instead of just his uniform. "What happens if they find us?" "Who's they?" he asked, though he probably knew. "The police, social services, our father." She counted them on her fingers like a grim inventory. "The people who think they know what's best for Sam." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the darkness stream past the windows. "Maya," he said finally, "I'm going to tell you something that might sound strange coming from a man whose job it is to follow schedules and regulations." He turned to look at her directly. "Sometimes the system works exactly the way it's supposed to, and sometimes it works in ways that would make you want to tear it down and start over. The trick is learning which situation you're in before you decide how to play it." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Thomas said, voice careful and deliberate, "that running away doesn't solve the problem. It just changes the location of the problem. But sometimes changing the location is what you need to do in order to solve it properly." Maya felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, but maybe the space where hope could grow if it was planted right. "Are you saying we should turn ourselves in?" "I'm saying," Thomas replied, "that Millfield has a family court judge named Eleanor Walsh who used to be a social worker before she was a lawyer, before she was a judge. I'm saying it has a police chief named Mike Henley who's got 3 daughters of his own and a wife who runs the crisis center. I'm saying it's got a town that's small enough to care and big enough to have resources." He leaned forward. "I'm saying that maybe running away was step 1, and step 2 is running towards something instead of just away from something." "And if we're wrong?" Maya asked. "If they send us back? Then you'll be in the same place you were before," Thomas said, "except you'll have tried something different, and Sam will know that someone fought for him, that someone thought he was worth the risk." Sam stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about elephants and trains and a place where the cookies never ran out. Maya watched his face, relaxed in sleep, free of the careful watchfulness he wore during waking hours like a second skin. This was the Sam she remembered from before, the one who believed in magic and drew pictures of families with everyone smiling and asked questions that made adults laugh instead of flinch. "Tell me about Millfield," she said. The town that trains built Millfield announced itself, with a sunrise that turned the train windows into sheets of gold. Maya woke to the sound of brakes and the conductor's voice over the intercom. "Millfield Station, end of the line. Please gather your belongings and thank you for riding Atlantic and Eastern." The station was smaller than the platform they'd left behind. A single building painted red with white trim, flower boxes that looked like someone actually watered them, and a sign that said, "Millfield, population 3247 and growing in letters that were optimistic rather than boastful. The air smelled different here, cleaner with undertones of pine and the kind of quiet that meant space between people and their problems. Thomas helped them down from the train car, carrying Sam's backpack and pretending not to notice when Maya counted and recounted their remaining money. $37 minus 2 bottles of water from the train's vending machine left them with $35, and the kind of math that meant they needed a plan. Before lunch, Station Master's office is right there, Thomas said, pointing to a door marked Authorized Personnel Only in faded black letters. Claire Morrison runs it during the day, but she also runs the Family Services Office and the Crisis Center and anything else this town needs running. She's good people. Will you? Maya started, then stopped, because asking favors was a muscle she'd forgotten how to use. I'll come with you, Thomas said gently. Introduction purposes, railroad, employee privilege. The station master's office was bigger than it looked from outside, with windows on 3 walls that let in enough light to make the old furniture look friendly rather than shabby. Maps covered one wall, train routes marked in red, bus lines in blue, and what looked like a hand-drawn chart showing places to get help, with phone numbers written in neat block letters. Behind a desk that had seen several decades of coffee rings and careful paperwork, a woman in her 50s looked up from a ledger with the kind of smile that meant business in the best possible way. Claire Morrison had the hands of someone who had learned to fix things that broke, and the eyes of someone who knew the difference between broken and bent. Her gray hair was pulled back in a ponytail that said she was too busy for fuss, but not too busy for style. She wore a sweater that had definitely seen better years, but was clean and mended with care. Thomas Murphy, she said, standing up to shake his hand. You're 3 hours early in bringing me passengers. This is either very good news or very complicated news. Little of both, Thomas admitted. Claire Morrison, I'd like you to meet Maya and Sam Rivera. They're looking for a soft landing and maybe some advice about how to stick it. Claire studied them with the quick assessment of someone who had learned to read situations faster than most people read newspapers. She took in Maya's protective stance, Sam's death grip on the stuffed elephant, the careful way they both positioned themselves near the door like runners at starting blocks. Advice I've got plenty of, she said. Coffee too if you're interested. Sam, that's a fine-looking elephant. Does he drink coffee or is he more of a hot chocolate person? Hot chocolate, Sam said immediately. But just a little. He gets hyper if he has too much sugar. Claire nodded gravely. Elephants are notorious for that. Good thing I keep the low-sugar kind on hand. She moved to a coffee station that looked like it had been assembled from parts of several different machines and somehow achieved perfect functionality. Maya, you look like someone who's been making adult decisions for a while. Coffee or chocolate? Coffee, Maya said, because she had been making adult decisions for a while, and coffee was what adults drank when they were trying to figure out how to fix problems they hadn't created. Claire poured 3 cups of coffee and 1 mug of hot chocolate, arranging them on a tray with sugar packets and cream containers that had definitely been borrowed from a restaurant. Sit, she said, gesturing to chairs that were mismatched but comfortable. Tell me where you're coming from and where you're trying to get to. Maya looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. She looked at Sam, who was blowing on his hot chocolate and making faces at Buster. She looked at Claire, who was waiting with the patience of someone who had heard difficult stories before and knew they took time to tell properly. We're running away, Maya said, because sometimes the truth was the fastest route between 2 points. From our father. He hits Sam. He's going to hit him worse when he finds out that social services is investigating. She pulled the crumpled letter from her pocket and smoothed it on the table. Court date is in 2 days. If we go back, Sam goes into the system and I go into a group home and he gets sent to live with strangers who might be just as bad. Claire read the letter with the concentration of someone who had seen hundreds of similar documents. Marcus Rivera, she said, address in the city. And you two got on a train last night and rode it to the end of the line because here felt safer than there. Thomas said you might know someone, Maya said. Someone who could help us figure out what to do next that doesn't involve going back. Thomas was right, Claire said. She stood up and moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder thick with forms and contact information. Question is, do you want help that keeps you hiding, or help that stops you from having to hide? Maya and Sam looked at each other. One of those sibling conversations that happened entirely through facial expressions and the kind of understanding that came from years of protecting each other. We want to stop hiding, Sam said quietly, surprising everyone, including himself. Papers, promises, and proof. The next 4 hours were a masterclass in small-town bureaucracy that actually worked. Claire made phone calls with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly which numbers to dial and what to say to get human beings instead of recording systems. She spoke in a mixture of legal terminology and plain English, translating concepts like emergency protective custody and interstate jurisdiction into language that sounded less like threat and more like roadmap. Judge Eleanor Walsh arrived at noon, not in robes, but in jeans and a blazer that said she was serious about her job, but also serious about being approachable. She was younger than Maya had expected, maybe 45, with graying blonde hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from caring about too many cases. She sat up in Claire's office like she'd done this before, spreading legal pads and law books across the desk with the familiarity of someone who knew that justice sometimes happened in train stations instead of courtrooms. "Maya," she said, settling into her chair and folding her hands on the table. "I've been a family court judge for 8 years. Before that, I was a social worker for 10 years. Before that, I was a kid whose mother moved us 6 times in 4 years to stay ahead of a man who thought his fists were a reasonable way to express disappointment." She paused. "I tell you this not for sympathy, but so you know I understand the math you've been doing, weighing the risk of staying against the risk of leaving, trying to figure out which choice hurts Sam less." Maya felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, but recognition. Someone who understood the calculation. "What I need from you," Judge Walsh continued, "is the truth. Not the version of the truth you've been telling teachers and school nurses and neighbors. Not the version that protects your father or protects the idea of your family. The version that protects Sam. Can you do that?" Maya looked at Sam, who was coloring in a book Claire had found in her desk drawer. He was drawing. Careful flowers in a garden, each one a different color, each one perfect and contained within its lines. "Yes," she said. "The truth took 2 hours to tell properly." Maya spoke in chronological order, starting with the first time their father had hit her. She was 13, had left dishes in the sink, and he'd been drinking since their mother left 6 months earlier. She talked about learning to read his moods like weather patterns, about developing strategies for keeping Sam out of the line of fire, about the gradual escalation that had taught her the difference between a slap that left no mark and a shove that left bruises. She had to explain. She told Judge Walsh about the night 3 weeks ago when she'd found Sam hiding in the closet with Buster, crying because their father had grabbed his arm hard enough to leave finger-shaped bruises when Sam had accidentally broken a picture frame. She told her about the teacher who had noticed Sam's flinching, about the school nurse who had asked questions Maya couldn't answer without lying, about the social worker who had started making phone calls. Sam, for his part, drew flowers and occasionally looked up to nod when Maya said something particularly true. He didn't speak until Judge Walsh asked him directly, "Sam, is there anything you want to add to what Maya has told me?" He looked up from his coloring book with the serious expression of someone who had been thinking about this question for longer than anyone should have to. "I don't want to go back," he said simply. "And I don't want Maya to get in trouble for taking care of me. She's good at it, better than the grown-ups." Judge Walsh wrote something in her legal pad that Maya couldn't read upside down. "Sam," she said, "what would make you feel safest right now?" "Staying with Maya," he said immediately. "And maybe staying here, where the people are nice and the train conductor brings sandwiches and nobody yells." He paused, considering. "And maybe getting a different dad, one who doesn't have angry hands." The silence that followed was the kind that held space for everyone to acknowledge that 10-year-olds shouldn't have to use phrases like angry hands, but that sometimes they did. And sometimes the best thing adults could do was listen. "Okay," Judge Walsh said finally. "Here's what we're going to do. Maya, I'm going to grant you temporary emergency guardianship of Sam, effective immediately. This gives you the legal right to make decisions about his care, his education, his medical needs, all of it. It also means that if your father tries to take him back, he has to go through me first." Maya blinked. Can you do that? We're not even from here." "I can do that," Judge Walsh said, with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to use the system to protect children instead of processing them. "Emergency protective custody crosses state lines when there's documented evidence of abuse and flight to safety. You've got both. The question is what happens next. The father who followed, What happened next was Marcus Rivera arriving on the 4:47 train with a face like a thunderstorm and a lawyer who looked like he charged by the minute. Maya saw them through the station window, her father's familiar silhouette made strange by rage and the distance of 3 states. The man beside him carrying a briefcase like a weapon and checking his phone like it held the secrets to winning wars. "That's him," she said to Claire, who was refilling coffee cups and pretending this was a normal Tuesday afternoon in a train station that doubled as family court. "That's our father." Sam looked up from his coloring book, and Maya watched his entire body change. Shoulders hunching, hand gripping his crayon tight enough to break it, eyes going wide and careful in the way that meant he was calculating distances to exits. "I don't want to see him," he said very quietly. "You don't have to," Judge Walsh said firmly. She had changed from her blazer into something that looked more official, had pulled her hair back in a way that meant business, and had arranged her legal documents across the desk, like armor made of paperwork. "Claire, is there somewhere Sam can wait that's not here?" Claire nodded toward a door marked Employee Break Room. "Thomas is back there with Maria. That's the engineer's wife I was telling you about. She brought cookies and a deck of cards and approximately 47 stories about her grandchildren. Sam would be very safe and very entertained." Maya watched Sam gather Buster and his coloring supplies, watched him look back at her with eyes that held trust and terror in equal measure. "I'll be right here," she promised. "I won't go anywhere without you." "Promise?" he asked, because promises were the currency of safety in a world that had taught him to doubt everything else. "Promise," she said, and meant it with every cell in her body. The break room door closed just as the station's front door opened with a bang that made everyone jump except Judge Walsh, who had clearly been expecting Marcus Rivera to announce himself exactly this way. He was exactly as Maya remembered and entirely different. Still tall, still broad-shouldered, still carrying himself like someone who expected the world to step aside when he walked. But there was something desperate around his eyes now, something that looked like panic, dressed up as anger. The lawyer beside him was younger than Maya had expected, with the kind of expensive haircut that suggested he was either very good at his job or very good at convincing people he was. "Where are my children?" Marcus demanded, looking around the station office like he expected to find them hiding behind the coffee machine. "Mr. Rivera," Judge Walsh said, standing up behind the desk with the kind of calm authority that made the space feel more like a courtroom and less like a train station. "I'm Judge Eleanor Walsh, Millfield Family Court. Your daughter Maya and son Sam are currently under emergency protective custody pending a formal hearing." The lawyer stepped forward with a folder full of what looked like very official documents. "Your Honor, I'm David Chen, representing Mr. Rivera. My client has legal custody of his minor children and demands their immediate return. This temporary guardianship appears to have been granted without proper notice or due process." Maya found her voice, though it felt smaller than it had 20 minutes ago. "Due process," she repeated. "Like the due process Sam got when you grabbed his arm hard enough to leave bruises? Like the due process I got when you shoved me into a wall for leaving dishes in the sink?" Marcus's face did something that Maya recognized, the expression that came right before his voice got loud and his hands got busy. "Maya Elizabeth Rivera," he said, and her full name sounded like a threat. "You have no idea what you've started, no idea what you've thrown away. Do you think these people care about you? Do you think they'll want you when you're not a shiny new victim anymore?" "Mr. Rivera," Judge Walsh interrupted, and her voice had gained several degrees of judicial temperature. "You will address your daughter with respect, or you will address her through your attorney. Those are your options." The lawyer touched Marcus's arm in a way that clearly meant, "Calm down. You're not helping your case." "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "my client is understandably emotional. These children were taken from their home without his knowledge, without a proper investigation, without a proper investigation?" Maya stood up, and she was surprised to hear that her voice was getting louder instead of smaller. "There was an investigation. By the school, by Child Protective Services, by teachers who notice that Sam flinches when adults raise their voices and draws pictures of houses with no doors. The investigation is what we were running from." She pulled the crumpled EO court summons from her pocket and slammed it on the desk. "This investigation, the one that was going to take Sam away from me and put him in foster care while you got anger management classes and supervised visits and a chance to convince another social worker that you've changed. Marcus looked at the document like it was written in a foreign language. That's Maya, sweetheart. That's not how this works. Foster care isn't. They were going to help us. As a family, they were going to give us resources, counseling, support. They were going to give you another chance, Maya said. And now she was definitely yelling, and she didn't care who heard. Another chance to get angry when dinner wasn't ready fast enough. Another chance to grab Sam's arm when he spilled juice. Another chance to slam doors and punch walls and make us both afraid to breathe too loud. She took a shaky breath. How many chances do you think you deserve? The silence that followed was the kind that happens when everyone in a room realizes they're witnessing something that can't be unsaid or undone. Marcus looked at his daughter, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. The lawyer looked at his client like he was recalculating his chances of winning. Judge Walsh looked at Maya like she was seeing exactly the kind of courage that family courts were designed to protect. Mr. Rivera, Judge Walsh said finally, would you like to tell me your version of these events? Trial by testimony. What followed was not quite a trial and not quite a mediation, but something that borrowed from both and cared more about truth than procedure. Judge Walsh had Thomas bring in extra chairs and asked Claire to make sure the coffee pot stayed full, and propped the break room door open so Sam could hear his sister's voice without having to see their father's face. Marcus Rivera told his story like a man who had practiced it in mirrors and bars and late-night phone calls to friends who had stopped answering. He was a single father doing his best in difficult circumstances. His wife had left them, abandoned them, really, for a life that didn't include the hard work of raising children. He worked 2 jobs to keep them housed and fed and clothed. Sometimes he lost his temper, yes, but what parent didn't? Sometimes he had to use physical discipline, but that wasn't abuse. That was parenting the way he'd been parented. Maya was a good girl, he said, but she was 17 and dramatic and had filled Sam's head with ideas about normal families that just didn't exist in the real world. They were fine. They were managing. They were a family working through their problems, and the state had no business breaking them apart based on the word of a child who watched too much television and thought families were supposed to look like sitcoms. It was a good story, told by someone who believed it completely. Maya recognized it. She'd heard variations of it every time a teacher had asked about a bruise, every time a neighbor had called to check on noise, every time Sam had come home from school with questions about why other kids' dads didn't yell like theirs did. When he finished, Judge Walsh thanked him for his honesty and asked if he had anything else to add. Marcus looked at Maya like he expected her to nod along, to support his version of events, to be the good daughter who understood that loyalty meant silence. Instead, Maya asked if Sam could come sit with her. He appeared in the doorway like a small ghost, clutching Buster and looking at everyone in the room except their father. Maya held out her hand and he crossed to her chair, climbing onto her lap despite being too big for it, because sometimes safety mattered more than dignity. Sam, Judge Walsh said gently, your dad just told me his side of the story. Is there anything you'd like to tell me about yours? Sam was quiet for a long moment, pressing his face into Buster's felt fur. When he spoke, his voice was so soft that everyone had to lean forward to hear it. He says he doesn't hit, Sam whispered, but my arm still has the bruises. He pulled up his sleeve to show finger-shaped marks that had faded from purple to yellow, but were still clearly visible. And he says Maya's dramatic, but she's the one who makes sure I eat dinner and helps me with homework and holds me when I have nightmares about the yelling. He looked up at Judge Walsh with eyes that held more truth than most adults could bear to carry. I know he's my dad, he said, but Maya's the one who takes care of me. The lawyer started to say something about parental alienation and coaching children to lie, but Judge Walsh held up a hand that stopped him mid-sentence. Mr. Chen, she said, I've been working with families for 18 years. I know the difference between coached testimony and lived experience. This child is telling the truth. Marcus made a sound that was half sob and half anger. Sam, he said, and his voice, cracked in a way that made him sound younger and more broken than Maya had ever heard. Son, I never meant, I would never hurt you on purpose. You have to know that. You're my boy. You're all I have left. Sam looked at him for the first time since entering the room. I know you love me, he said, with the terrible clarity of children who understand more than they should have to. But loving me and hurting me aren't supposed to happen at the same time. The station master's choice. The decision didn't happen all at once. Judge Walsh called a recess while she reviewed the case files that had been faxed from the city. the school records that documented Sam's behavioral changes, the photographs the social worker had taken of Maya's bruises 6 months ago that Maya had explained away as clumsiness. She interviewed Thomas about what he'd observed on the train, interviewed Claire about the resources available in Millfield, interviewed Maria about whether 2 children could stay with her and her husband temporarily while more permanent arrangements were made. During the break, Marcus sat in a corner of the station with his lawyer, speaking in low voices that occasionally rose to sharp whispers. Maya caught fragments: custody rights, interstate complications, appeals process, supervised visits, anger management requirements. It was the language of a system trying to balance the rights of parents against the safety of children, and Maya understood that she and Sam were both the subject and the object of that balance. Sam colored quietly at a small table Claire had set up, working on a picture of a train with faces in the windows. Happy faces, Maya noticed, with big smiles and carefully drawn eyes that looked forward instead of back. Occasionally he would look up and catch her watching him, and he would smile in that way that meant, "I'm okay as long as you're here." When Judge Walsh reconvened their informal hearing, she had arranged her papers in neat stacks and had the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to defend it. "Mr. Rivera," she said, "I'm going to be very direct with you. Your children are afraid of you. Not just nervous or upset, afraid. Sam flinches when adults raise their voices. Maya has been lying to teachers and social workers for years to protect you from the consequences of your actions. These are not children who are being difficult or dramatic. These are children who have been living in survival mode." Marcus started to interrupt, but she continued without pausing. "However, I also believe that you love your children and that your actions come from a place of pain rather than malice. The question is whether love is enough to overcome the damage that's been done, and whether Sam and Maya can be safe while that healing happens." She turned to Maya. "Maya, I'm continuing your emergency guardianship of Sam for the next 90 days. During that time, you'll both remain in Millfield under the supervision of Claire Morrison and the support of this community. You'll attend school here, receive counseling services, and have the time and space to decide what you want your futures to look like." Maya felt Sam's grip on her hand tighten with relief. "Mr. Rivera," Judge Walsh continued, "you have 90 days to demonstrate that you can provide a safe environment for your children. That means completing an anger management program, attending family therapy, allowing supervised visits with Sam and Maya, and proving to me that you understand the difference between discipline and abuse. If you can do that, really do it, not just go through the motions. We'll revisit custody arrangements." "And if he can't?" Maya asked, because she needed to know what happened if their father chose his anger over their safety. "Then we'll discuss permanent guardianship options," Judge Walsh said. "Either with you, Maya, when you turn 18 in 8 months, or with another family member, or through adoption if that's what you and Sam choose." Marcus stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward. "You can't do this," he said, and his voice had the edge that Maya recognized as the sound that came before things got broken. "You can't just take my children away and give them to strangers. They're my family. They're all I have." "Mr. Rivera," Judge Walsh said with the kind of calm that came from years of practice with angry men in family court, "I'm not taking them away. I'm giving them space to be safe while you figure out how to be the father they need instead of the father you've been. The choice of whether this separation is temporary or permanent is entirely up to you." The lawyer whispered something urgent in Marcus's ear, but Marcus shook his head and stepped toward Maya and Sam with an expression that made Sam press his face against Maya's shoulder and go very still. Thomas appeared between Marcus and the children with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 37 years learning when to be polite and when to be immovable. "Mr. Rivera," he said politely, "I think you should take some time to consider the judge's offer. Maybe take a walk around town, get some air, cool down before you make any decisions you can't take back." It wasn't a suggestion, and everyone in the room understood that. Marcus looked at his children, at Maya's protective stance and Sam's fearful hiding, and something shifted in his face. Not understanding exactly, but maybe the beginning of recognition. "This isn't over," he said, but it sounded more like grief than threat. "No," Judge Walsh agreed. "It's not, but it's paused, which is what everyone needs right now. Home is where the train stops." 90 days turned out to be exactly the right length of time for several important things to happen. Sam started third grade at Millfield Elementary in a classroom with windows that looked out at a playground where children played without watching the adults on the sidelines for signs of incoming weather. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had 23 years of experience and the gift of seeing children clearly, not just their behaviors, but the reasons behind their behaviors. She didn't ask Sam why he flinched when she moved too quickly. She just learned to move slowly around him until he learned that her movements weren't threats,